Hi, my name's Erin.
Hi, I'm Brittany.
And this is To Be Very Honest. We are going to have a longer discussion off of our really short video where we talked about intersectional activism. Go check it out. If you click on the bubble around here, then you'll be able to go directly to that video and watch us what we talked about first. And then now we're going to talk about that in much larger, unpacked detail.
So it's Black History Month, and so we're talking about Black history in tandem with activism and other people, intersectional, other racial groups that have come on as allies in that work.
Yeah, cool. So I guess I kind of want to start off by talking about within the civil rights movement how there were different allies who were involved with that. So of course, there were white people who marched in the Million Man March and also marched in other marches before that to serve as kind of like white shields to the Black civil rights protesters and stuff like that. And to use their privilege as a part of those protests. So one example is, of course, when people would go to the diners and things like that, then the white people would go in first to those diners and kind of try to be a buffer. Of course, wasn't always successful, and because it was illegal at the time, of course. So I mean, like, it wasn't successful. Things happened, but they tried to serve as a buffer for those people for those activists to protect them. And so I guess the first question that I have for you is, what have you seen as far as intersectional activism in today's activist movement?
Well, I don't think I see it as much as I would like to see it.
Okay.
Right? Not that it doesn't happen, but a really cool thing that did happen that I was hearing about when I was at a panel on, it was about state violence and police brutality. And they were talking about a situation, so Black Lives Matter, they would go, I think, to different town meetings and different things that were happening. And when the police department would meet and they would have like a time where people could talk, right, beforehand and give like short statements and whatnot. And oftentimes, you know, if it's just people who are Black going, people get arrested or people get, you know, this one woman, she got arrested because she went a few seconds over the amount of time that you were allowed to speak. So one situation that they went and each person was paired with a white ally or white shield, you know, we could say, which I love that term. And the white person, like when police came in, stood in front of the Black person and nobody got arrested that day. And
that's white privilege.
Yeah, I know. It's white privilege, right? And so, like, I think using that privilege in those spaces to be like, no, we are protecting, you're not going to take this person, you're going to take me first, you know? I think that type of activism is something, hearing about that made me, like, excited. And I think, it's something to think about. Obviously, it's one of those things, like, even when we were talking before, when there was going to be a Black Lives Matter thing and a hearing, and I was thinking about going, and you were just like, be careful. You know, it's like one of those situations where it's like, as the small woman, I'm like, I can be very easily hurt.
No, like, Politicon, super awesome. We went to this panel about Black Lives Matter, which was talking about local activists in the LA and specifically Pasadena area, which Politicon was being hosted in Pasadena that year. And it was amazing because we had gone it was for 2 days, and we'd gone to all these other different panels talking about gun rights and talking about terrorism and all these different, it's nonpartisan, so there's anything under the sun. And we'd gone to all of these. And there were no police at those panels, right? They were not like standing in front of the doors. You know, there were no police. I mean, you saw the police outside the building because they were protecting the building in case something happened. Because when you have big events, they show up as security. That's completely understandable. But it was a conference. But when we were at the Black Lives Matter like seminar, there were police officers who were walking up and down the hallway. There were 2 police guards posted at the door, and then several police officers came
in
inside
during
during
the
the
panel.
conversation, during the panel.
But it was kind of amazing
Yeah.
because during it, they like pointed that fact out, right?
Yeah.
And everybody turns around and looks at the police in the
Yeah.
back. And like people started standing up and like telling them to leave.
Yeah.
And they did.
Which was a very intense
It
situation.
was
But like
intense,
that was
but
a
it was
panel,
so
so you
good.
can imagine what it's like when there's legal action being involved. So we're talking about like having a hearing or an event or a rally. And so I think that brings up a point about privilege, right? So a lot of internet dialogue about privilege, whether it's white privilege or male privilege or native born privilege or body privilege or whatever privilege, it's a shaming thing, right? Like we're like, stop talking, it's white privilege, you have white privilege, you shouldn't talk. Or like, oh, you're man privilege, you're mansplaining to me. So explain, I think, your take on privilege and how that can be used for good in activism and things like that, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it can be used for good, like in an example of what we were just talking about. I think it's complicated, right? So we have the whole issue, like, so for example, I mean, it can relate, but so for example, like within feminism, right? Like when some of my male friends who are talking about feminism and stand up when there's, sexist jokes or language or whatever that's being used, and they stand up and they say something like, no, this isn't okay, and this is why, and they break it down. Like, I love that, and that I think is really necessary. But I hate the idea that you have to use the power systems in play to undo, to start to work against the power that's oppressing people. It's hard.
I'm gonna
right?
push back on that.
Go for it. Yeah.
No, I mean, in the sense that, for me personally, I believe when it comes to allyship, it is, of course, you should always make sure that you're listening to the people you're being allies for. So you don't want to be a savior and you walk in and go, I'm going to solve this issue. You want to ask them and talk to them and make sure that you're always checking in and you're saying, this is the issue. How is that going? How can I help? How can I be of assistance? But the problem is that power dynamics are institutionalized.
Yes.
And they're historic and systemic for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And they're permutable, right? So they change as time changes. And so the thing is that if we're realistic, at the end of the day, these power systems do exist.
Of course.
And we have to go about it from multiple different angles to
And
make
I think
sure that
that's the thing. Going about it from different angles. So obviously there is that power dynamic and then there is that privilege, right? And so it's like, obviously it should be utilized in ways that you're coming alongside these communities that are doing the work. But again, it should always be the listening first and asking them, what do you want us to do? Like, instead of coming in and being like, oh, well, I'll do this for you. Oh, I'll help you, poor people, So it's listening first and taking direction from those communities that are fighting for,
Yeah, and one thing
their
I think
civil
that's-
rights or whatever it is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one thing that's important about listening, and it's something I have to work on myself, is it's not so much listening for when I can talk next.
Oh, yeah.
If that kind of makes sense, because that definitely happens, especially as a guy. I have male privilege, and when people come to me with problems, I kind of do the very traditional guy thing of like, I'm gonna solve it now. And so I'm listening, I'm very much listening, and I'm like, okay, cool, wait, they stopped talking now. I'll jump in. Here we go, solution. Aren't I great? So listening is about like hearing and comprehending and actually being silent, like sometimes.
And letting what the person said change you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like the point is to understand first, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem where people don't want to talk about race or they don't want to talk about gender because it makes them feel uncomfortable or it makes them, feel ashamed or it makes them like get defensive. But like then what's happening there is like they're thinking about it from their perspective, right? The defensiveness comes from something about me. But if you're actually listening, trying to understand, the focus is on the other person and their experience, right? So I mean, I think that's what we have to go into those spaces with that mindset, or else, it's not gonna be as productive as it should be, and it's not gonna be hopefully as healthy as we would want it. So.
But speaking of like being productive and successful, a lot of people tend to use allyship as a title. I am an ally, instead of using it as a state of being, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And so that actually came up with some problems with the most recent Women's March, which, if you're watching Spicer, the election was much bigger than the Women's March. Definitely, for sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
We saw the pictures.
We saw the pictures, so they were bigger. No, but there was.
It's like, come on, there's Photoshop. Like, if you really want to do that, add a few more, 1,000 people,
or just use Obama's one and like change the signs. I don't know.
Look at all the brown people here.
I don't know. Anyway. But back to the point.
Yes.
And the point is that when it came to the Women's March, it was very multicultural, and it wasn't just women who were marching.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There were lots of allies there. But there were also like tensions because different ally groups felt like they were being silenced or they were being excluded. So women who wanted to march against Trump but were not for abortions. They were pro-life women. And then also there were, of course, different people who were allies that maybe were like celebrities who weren't always for the cause of like, like what people would say are feminist values, but
they give lip surface to it every once in a while.
Sure. So like, what are your thoughts on that as far as like activism goes? Because like that was those allies made that bigger, right? They made the numbers larger. So is it good to have as many allies as possible? Like at the end of the day, I'm supporting you, so be thankful.
Well, okay, yeah. So from the first point, it being like a title, right? You can slap on like, I am an ally. I think, it's a state of being as in acting, right? So like, we only really are what we do. So you can say you're an ally, but if you don't do anything, then okay. You'll betray yourself. And then, I mean, sure. I mean, I'm glad the Women's March happened. I'm glad so many people came out. But also, like, I couldn't help while I was in that crowd just being like, how many of you people here, like, how many of you guys here, they're like, oh, I'm gonna wear, like, I'm gonna have a sign that says, like, I'm a feminist. I'm like, but then if you're gonna go, if you, like, do you actually operate in that in your daily life, when you're hanging out with your guy friends? Like, is that actually what you're doing? Or do you just like, is it just kind of one of those things like, I'll pat myself on the back and I'll feel better about myself. I did something, But it's like, you can say you support women, but if you're not going to do anything on the ground, then you're not actively supporting, there's no operative thing going on. It's just like a story you're telling yourself. So
I think that's an interesting point, and I think that there's something that comes from that, and that's, first off, actions can be done in a variety of ways. So that's not necessarily just marching. So marching is great and it's very important, and it definitely it shows the number of people behind something.
The hope is marching is like the least of the amount of the things you do. Right?
Yeah. No, but I mean, like, also that can include donating money or volunteering and things like that. I guess, like, I just want to kind of make it very clear that it's not only about marching. But it's also important to do that marching.
I mean, it's talking to legislators. It's working with grassroots organizations that are actually doing these things,
And calling your congresspeople, like, calling your legislators, calling your congresspeople and your senators all the time. Have them know your name, because
have them on speed dial.
If you don't call them, they kind of just go like, oh, what do my donors think? Or I think I'm doing the right thing and no one's called and complained yet, so I'm doing fine. And even if they're on what you support, you'd be surprised at how they sometimes need to be reminded, because they will stray one way or another. And that's regardless of your partisan party. Like, they tend to just kind of vote against things that you would be like, I kind of assumed that you would vote. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, is going to the town hall meetings, it's going to those different things and like actually being a part of some of the organizations that are working, against all of these, oppressive and marginalizing institutions and structures. And so it's like, join your local, Black Lives Matter page.
Yeah.
And like when the events are coming up, like go to some of them.
Yeah.
And like for a lot of people it can be a little overwhelming, right? Because it's like there's so many social issues and there's so many problems, but like get your feet wet, like try it and then go somewhere with it instead of, it's not that marching is bad, but like if that's all you do, like I don't think it's gonna actually be effective in change in the long term.
Yeah, and because I think that's kind of felt. That's I guess maybe one of my worries, right, with the Women's March was how much of a event it was and how there were like celebrities there and things like that, and we don't get that kind of attention or celebrity involvement in like Black Lives Matter protesting against police violence against all people. Like it's not an all lives matter thing, it's Black Lives Matter, but the thing is that Black Lives Matter is fighting against police brutality, against just in general about the militarization of the police.
Yeah. Which
so
is
like
my favorite. Okay, there was a lot of clever, amazing signs, at the marches. But my absolute favorite is the one that I saw was, we'll see all of you nice white ladies at the next Black Lives Matters march, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was my favorite because it's like, I think that was a big thing, was there was a lot of intersectionality happening at the march, but it wasn't necessarily acknowledged.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of things posting about
the platform.
Indigenous people, right? Who, like, there were totally racist things done against them, like, at the march. And so to also put this blanket of, like, oh, all women, like, all women, and we all make 70 cents to the dollar. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
And so it's hard with things like that. Like, yes, you want to be in solidarity, but also not put a blanket over it so that you erase the intersectionality that's happening and like the different struggles that each individual community, is undergoing, and then you're not involved in counteracting any of that, especially if you are a white woman or a white person in general,
or a guy who's going to a women's march.
Definitely. Talking to you, that you're using that privilege, in tandem with these communities.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I think that also brings up a good point is, we talked about in the main video, we're like, oh, you can watch movies, like Hidden Figures, be like, I'd be one of those people who was marching with Dr. King, because everyone loves Dr. Martin Luther King. Not many people have read all of his works, but everyone definitely knows I have trim speech.
They generally they'll post like inspirational quotes, the ones that aren't too controversial, the ones that don't make him sound like a socialist Democrat, right? The ones that aren't about economic problems, not taking note that like, okay, when he was killed, what was, he was doing work with unions, right? And he was like so talking about economic institutions. And so he was very intersectional in that way.
He was very intersectional, but I guess the other point that I wanted to make too was that at the time he was also wildly unpopular. Like very, very unpopular.
What?
Yeah. His approval ratings were really, really low. What's also a really random, weird coincidence is that his numbers directly mirror current day perceptions on Black Lives Matter activism, right? So lots of people during that time had views about desegregation. They're like, it's too early, or they're asking for extra rights. They're asking for too much. They're complaining too much, or I don't think they're going about this the right way, or oh, it would have been so much better if they hadn't had rioted that one time because there's a riot. So now the whole Martin Luther King movement doesn't make sense, and they're doing illegal things. So how can I support that, right? Those were the common stories that you were hearing. And those are also really common excuses that you're hearing now, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to the Black Lives Matter, yeah.
Yeah, and I love that other post that you made after the march as well. That was basically saying, yeah, if you weren't complaining about like the traffic jams, the blocked off streets for the women's march, and you're just like, oh, but this is great, but then you are complaining when it happens with Black Lives Matter, like you need to like check your perspective.
And the thing is that we've all grown up in a culture where there is the racism and it's implicit, and it's not necessarily that it's as overt, because racism will adapt to the time, right? And so we kind of have these implicit ideas about, oh, I don't really like this or whatever, and they're affected by racism, right? And so when you're looking at Black Lives Matter, you're like, I don't like that they blocked roads and that it slowed down traffic for the day. It's like, but then if you're like, fist up, like, oh, the Women's March, there's some thoughts about that that you have to kind of unpack and go, well, why is that? And one thing that, like, a perfect example of the difference is the police reaction. So in Los Angeles, I don't know about the other places. I wasn't everywhere. But from what I read, it was very similar to Los Angeles, was that police were not showing up in riot gear, right? They were not showing up in the riot gear.
There was like barely any police you saw. I mean, sure there were some, but...
Yeah, but they weren't showing up in the riot gear, and they were not ready to fight. And that's because Miley Cyrus was in LA, right? Like, and James Franco, and it was a very big event where these people had privilege and they were not going to be challenged, right? If that kind of makes sense.
No.
And so it would be really great if those people were also then allies for things like the Black Lives Matter movement and stuff like that. Not trying to take the spotlight or the attention of, I'm Miley Cyrus fighting for Black people's rights. She should give her platform to say, here are Black activists who are speaking about this.
Sure.
Like, here's Michelle Alexander, et cetera, but also using her privilege and her abilities to try to,
Yeah. And I think one important thing, not being obviously Black myself, also what we were talking about, you want to watch these movies and these things and be like, I would have been that, good white person. But I don't know, for myself, like, I really do grapple with the fact that it's like, if I didn't grow up in LA, if I didn't have one parent, who's Japanese, if I didn't grow up in that context, I grew up somewhere completely different. I had 2 white parents. I grew up in a community of all white people who were all saying the same thing. Like, would I have been one? And I think that's a question that, I don't know, is important to think about, because it's not about shaming. It's just about being like, okay, we need to seek understanding and we need to move forward and we need to be in solidarity with these communities and actually take action, right? So I don't know. That's the hope for me. It's not like, oh, you're not doing enough. Have I done enough? No, there's never an enough, right? But there's a lot of, I think, issues within this to grapple with. Is just like, me going to some of these things, am I putting myself in danger? Am I putting my body on the line? And if I'm not going to do it because of that, well, it's like the very fact of being a Black person, your body is on the line anyway. So if I'm not willing to do that, those are the types of things that you kind of have to look at yourself and think about. Why am I not willing?
Definitely. Yeah. Final question for you. I am, someone who's new to this. I do feel like the cause, and I want to be an ally, whether that's an ally to feminism, women's rights, because I'm a dude, and I want, or I want to be an ally about anything, DAPL or whatever. What's some advice that you would give as someone who's an ally yourself on how to be a good ally?
Like for in any particular community,
just
or
in general, like, I guess, because like, I mean, it's great to say, oh, for like women do this or whatever, but like that'd be a very, very long video and forget people. So just like, here's a good start for like how to be a good ally, like some tips and stuff.
Yeah. I don't know. It's am I a good ally? I think a lot of it is educating yourself first, right? And listening first. Asking questions, but not on your terms. Like, I know what you were talking about before. It's just like somebody will be like, hit you up at whatever time of night and be like, what's your opinion on this black thing?
Yeah.
You know, and it's just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
You know, like to ask them like, hey, do you have the emotional energy to like talk about this right now? Because I'm really curious about this. I don't exactly know what to think about it, you know? So it's being conscientious of the person you're talking with. And yeah, I think a big thing is just like jumping in and trying to get involved. And I think really to be a good ally, you have to be ready and willing and okay with having criticism come back at yourself. Because there's going to be things that you're not going to do right, and there's going to be things that you don't understand. And instead of being defensive about it, or instead of it making you be discouraged so you stop doing it at all, just know it's going to happen and be okay with it and kind of welcome it and maybe even ask for it. Like, what are ways that you think that I could be a better ally? Yeah. So, I mean, those are just the things off the top of my head.
Yeah.
So, I know we're gonna wrap up soon, but just last question would be like, from your perspective as a black man, do you have anything that you want to kind of throw out there about allyship?
Sure. As an ally, I guess one of the main things that I think you should always be open to is asking questions and being able to take criticism. I think that's one thing that's really, really important. Another thing is about co-opting messages, and we'll definitely do another video on this a little bit longer because there's a lot to talk about. But I saw at the march things like trans lives matter or things like that, and it's co-opting a message, right? And we're all really, really creative, and we can come up with our own really great things. And so I think we should be very aware of that and try not to like steal attention or steal a message, right?
Of course, trans lives matter.
Yeah,
of
definitely,
course.
for sure.
But being sensitive to if you're co-opting someone else's, something that symbolizes their struggle, their fight, you know, maybe choosing something
Especially
different. But we'll unpack it.
Yeah,
later.
we'll unpack that more. But also, it does make a kind of weird point that like there aren't black trans people. There are, right? And so like that, you know what I mean? So like we want to think about that. The other thing is that just ask questions. I think that and then also be aware that who you're asking questions to does not necessarily represent the entirety of that group. So like me personally, I go by, I'm a black man, but some people like to go by the term African American, and there are reasons and historical reasons, which we might go into later on another one, because that's actually a really cool, interesting conversation on why we would do that. But so if you ask me and you say, oh, well, what do you call yourself? I would say, I call myself black, but other people might want to be called African American, so you should ask them. Don't make an assumption off of the one conversation that you have. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for now. More videos to come. But yeah, please make sure to comment at the bottom of this and let us know what you thought, if you have any questions, what you agreed with, what you disagreed with.
Yeah, what was helpful, what wasn't helpful.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
We definitely would like to hear back from you, get your feedback, and that'll influence as we go along and talk about these important issues.
Like the video, likes are great. Make sure to subscribe to the videos. Make sure to share the videos. This is a little bit longer.
Share the video with your racist friend. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Or your friend who wants to be an ally someday. Right? But yeah, that'd be really, really great. And until next time, to be very honest.
Well, see you then.
Bye.
Bye.